microphone shook in Rosalind Hale's hand as 300 guests turned to stare, and the wedding planner's voice cut through the string quartet like a blade. "Get her off the stage. She's an embarrassment in that dress." The Guilford ballroom went silent, except for the soft clink of champagne flutes being set down. Rosalind felt her face burn, but she didn't move. She'd sung at 40 weddings this year, and never once had someone said it out loud, in front of everyone, like she was furniture that didn't belong. "I said now," the planner hissed, snapping her fingers at the sound tech, like Rosalind wasn't a person who could hear her. Rosalind was 27, and she had spent most of those years being told she took up too much space. Too much space in a dress, in a room, in a family that had once had money and now had none. She'd learned to make herself smaller in every way except one, her voice. Nobody could shrink that. She lifted the microphone back to her lips. "I was hired to sing at last for the first dance," she said, calm and clear, the Brooklyn in her voice sharpening every syllable. "I intend to finish the song I was hired for. If that's a problem, take it up with the bride." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, uncertain, delighted. A man in a charcoal suit near the back, one that fit like it had been built onto him, did not laugh. He watched. His name was Damiano Rocca, 34 years old, and every person in that ballroom who mattered knew exactly who he was, which was why the room had gone quiet again the moment he leaned forward in his chair. He wasn't the groom. The groom was his younger sister's fiancé, a soft, easy kid named Peter Ashcombe, who had no idea what family he was marrying into. Damiano was the brother standing guard at the edge of his sister's happiness, the way he'd stood guard at the edge of everything since he was 19 and buried his mother in a box, too small for the truth of what had happened to her. He had come tonight expecting boredom. He had not expected a woman in an ice blue gown, built like something out of an old film, standing her ground against a wedding planner, with the flat, unbothered authority of someone who had already survived worse than public humiliation. "Let her sing," Damiano said. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. The planner's spine straightened like she'd been struck. "Mr. Rocca, I only meant, I know what you meant." He didn't look at her again. He looked at the woman on the small riser, and something in his chest, locked since he was 19, made a small, unfamiliar sound, like a door testing its hinges. "Sing," he said, quieter now, almost gentle, though gentle was not a word anyone who knew him would have used. Rosalind's eyes found his across the ballroom. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew the room had shifted around him like water around a stone, and that the planner, ready to have her thrown out 30 seconds earlier, was now apologizing to the air. She nodded once, to him, though she couldn't have said why, and turned back to the quartet and sang. She sang, "At Last," the way it was meant to be sung, low and aching and full, filling every corner of a room that had just tried to make her disappear. Peter Ashcombe took his new wife's hand and spun her, slow, and half the room was in tears by the second verse. Damiano sat very still and watched a woman he had never met sing like she had nothing left to prove and everything to give. He did not clap when she finished. He was not a man who clapped, but he stood and crossed the ballroom while the guests were still catching their breath, and Rosalind, gathering her sheet music with hands finally starting to shake, looked up to find him directly in front of her. Up close, he was harder to read. Dark eyes, a scar through one eyebrow, a stillness that made the hair on her arms rise, not from fear, but from the sense of standing too close to something, with real weight behind it. "You didn't have to defend yourself to her," he said. "I would have handled it." "I've been handling myself since I was 15, Rosalind said. "I don't need a bodyguard, Mr. Rocca," he said. Damiano Rocca. She knew the name. Everyone in the wedding industry in this part of New York knew it, the way you knew which streets not to walk down after dark. The Rocca family did not run charities. They ran everything else. "Well, Mr. Rocca," she said, holding his gaze, because she'd promised herself years ago she would never let a rich man's name make her small. "Your sister's fiancé should know. His wedding singer just got threatened with removal over the size of her dress. Might want a word with your planner about who she hires next time." Something almost like a smile moved across his mouth and vanished. "There won't be a next time. You're singing at my niece's christening in the spring, and every Rocca event after that, if you're willing." It wasn't a request. Rosalind understood that much in 4 minutes. But there was something underneath the command that didn't match the ice in his reputation, and it unsettled her more than the reputation itself. "I charge extra for families that let their staff insult their guests," she said. "Send the invoice to me directly," Damiano said, "not to her." He glanced once, cold and brief, at the planner still hovering by the cake table, and the woman flinched like she'd been slapped. She won't be working Rocca events again. He turned to go, then stopped, and looked back at Rosalind with an expression she wouldn't be able to name for weeks, not until she understood exactly how much he'd already lost, and how much he was afraid to lose again. "You have a gift," he said. "Don't let people who can't see it decide what it's worth." He walked away before she could answer, back into the crowd that parted for him, the way water parts for something that has never had to ask. Rosalind stood there, sheet music pressed to her chest, watching him go, with no idea that the man who had just spoken a handful of sentences to her was about to change the shape of her life, or that somewhere in that ballroom, a woman in white lace, with a diamond the size of a knuckle on her hand, was watching the exchange with her jaw tight and her mind already turning toward something dangerous. Camille Voss had been engaged to Damiano Rocca for 11 months. She had never once seen him cross a room for anyone. She was already reaching for her phone before the song was even fully over. 3 weeks after the wedding, Rosalind's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and a man's assistant told her, without preamble, that Mr. Rocca required her at the Rocca estate in Oyster Bay on Saturday to discuss recurring arrangements. No pleasantries, no negotiation, just an address, a time, and the click of someone hanging up. She almost didn't go. She told herself that for 3 days, staring at the address written on the back of a grocery receipt. But the truth was simpler than her hesitation let on. The Rocca family paid what they promised, on time, in full, and Rosalind had a stack of unpaid bills, and a brother 2 semesters from a nursing degree he couldn't afford to finish. She went. The estate wasn't what she expected. Not marble and gold, but something quieter, older. A house that had belonged to a family for generations, rather than one bought to announce a fortune. A grand piano sat in the front room, dust-free, clearly played, and she found herself staring at it a beat too long, before staff led her to a study at the back. Damiano stood at the window when she entered, his back to her. "You're punctual," he said. "I appreciate that in people I intend to keep around. I'm not a piece of furniture you're arranging, Mr. Rocca." He turned, something almost like amusement in his jaw. "No, you made that clear at the wedding." He gestured to a chair. "I want to discuss a retainer. You sing at Rocca family functions exclusively, christenings, anniversaries, the gala in June, triple your current rate. Why?" The question seemed to surprise him. Men like Damiano Rocca weren't used to being asked why they wanted something. "Because you're good," he said, like it was the simplest fact in the world. "Because I watched 300 people who came for the open bar sit in silence over what you did with your voice. That's not common. I don't waste money on common things." Heat climbed Rosalind's neck, not from embarrassment, but from something else. Something that unsettled her, because she recognized it as the beginning of wanting to be seen by someone whose good opinion she had no business craving. "There's a condition," she said, because pride demanded it. "If I sing for your family, I do it as a professional, not as decoration. Not as something your fiancée gets to comment on because she doesn't like how I fill out a dress. Something shifted in his face at the mention of Camille. Camille won't speak to you that way again, Damiano said, his voice flattening. You have my word. His word meant something in that house. Over the following weeks, as Rosalind returned again and again for rehearsals and events, Camille Voss watched her with the wary, assessing eyes of a woman who knew exactly what threat looked like, even when it arrived in a body she'd been trained to underestimate. It was at the christening in April that the first real fracture appeared. Rosalind had arrived early to rehearse and found the nursery wing in chaos. An infant crying, a nanny frantic, Damiano's sister, Isabella, pale and shaking near the doorway. She's not breathing right, Isabella said, and Rosalind, trained years earlier in infant CPR, moved before she'd decided to move. She had the baby in her arms in seconds, tilting her, checking her airway with calm, practiced hands. A moment later, the baby coughed hard, and a small button, fallen from a blanket, came loose, and her cries turned from choked to loud and furious and entirely healthy. Damiano arrived just in time to see the resolution. Rosalind, in her performance gown, holding his infant niece against her shoulder, murmuring something low and soothing, while Isabella wept with relief. He didn't say anything for a long moment, then looked at Rosalind, the way a man looks at something he has badly misjudged the size of. You saved her. I did what anyone would do. No, not anyone. You. He took the baby gently, checking her over with clumsy tenderness, and when he looked back at Rosalind, something in his expression had changed permanently. Camille arrived 4 minutes later, heels clicking, and found the tail end of the scene, Damiano's hand briefly resting on Rosalind's shoulder in something like gratitude. What happened? She asked, sharp enough that everyone turned. Your future niece nearly choked, Damiano said, without softening it. Rosalind saved her life. Where were you? The question landed like a slap. Camille's eyes moved to Rosalind, quick and cold, cataloging something. Not gratitude. Calculation. I was on the phone, Camille said, too quickly, and Rosalind noticed her eyes dart to her purse, where a phone screen showed a text conversation she snapped shut. With whom? Damiano asked. Quiet in a way Rosalind was learning meant he was paying closer attention than his tone suggested. Wedding vendors, Damiano. Do you interrogate me now? He didn't answer, only looked at her a moment longer, something cold moving behind his eyes, before turning back to his niece. But the moment didn't disappear. Rosalind watched Camille's hand tighten around her purse, watched her gaze flick over with something that had curdled from jealousy into fear, and understood, without being able to prove a thing, that she had just made an enemy, with far more to protect than a fiancé's attention. That night, driving home in a second-hand Honda that rattled past 40 miles an hour, Rosalind's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stay away from what isn't yours. This is your only warning. She read it twice, hands cold on the wheel, and didn't notice the black sedan that had trailed her since she left the estate, and didn't yet understand that somewhere in that house, a woman with a diamond on her hand and a secret buried in her phone had decided Rosalind Hale was a problem that needed solving. Rosalind didn't tell anyone about the text. Not Marcus, who'd have wanted to call the police and gotten nowhere with a burner number. Not Damiano, because some instinct told her involving him would only prove she couldn't handle her own life without a Rocca standing between her and trouble. She'd spent too many years proving she didn't need saving to start needing it now, over a text from a coward hiding behind a blocked number. She deleted it and went to rehearsal anyway. The Rocca family gala was 2 weeks out, an annual event Damiano's late mother had started decades earlier. Ostensibly a charity fundraiser, though everyone in that world understood, it doubled as a demonstration of the family's reach. Damiano, in a move that surprised his staff, asked Rosalind to help select the set list from his mother's old sheet music, boxes stored in the estate's east wing that nobody had opened since the funeral 15 years earlier. "You don't have to do this," Rosalind said, the first time she found herself alone with him in that dusty room. "I can build a set list without going through her things." "I want you to," Damiano said, some old ache surfacing despite his effort to contain it. And Rosalind sat down across from him on the floor, the way she might have with an old friend, rather than a man whose name made grown adults nervous. They spent 3 hours going through the boxes. Rosalind learned his mother, Elena Rocca, had trained as a classical pianist before marrying into the family, had given it up the year Damiano turned 12, and had died when he was 19, in what the papers called a car accident on the Long Island Expressway. "You don't believe it was an accident," Rosalind said quietly, watching him hold a piece of sheet music with his mother's handwriting in the margins. "Why would you say that?" "Because you're holding that paper like it's the last piece of evidence, in a case nobody else believes is still open." He didn't answer for a long moment. No skid marks. No mechanical failure. "My father closed the investigation within a week. I was 19. I didn't have the power to ask why yet." His jaw tightened. "By the time I did, everyone who might have known something was gone, retired, paid off, or dead." "I'm sorry," Rosalind said, meaning it in the plain, unshowy way that came from having buried her own losses without spectacle. "Don't be sorry. Be useful. You knew Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat by the second measure. Where did you study?" "Manhattan School of Music, before my father's business collapsed, and took our tuition money with it." She said it plainly, without the shame she'd carried for years. "I was going to be a concert pianist. Then I figured out singing at other people's weddings paid better than crying about the life I didn't get." "I looked into your family's business before I hired you," Damiano admitted. "I wanted to know who I was letting this close to my family. Hale Fabrication. Good reputation, until it wasn't. You had me investigated. It wasn't quite an accusation. I have everyone investigated who gets close to me. It's the only way I've survived this long." He held her gaze. "You came back clean. Cleaner than most people born into money." Something shifted behind his eyes, recalibrating, the way a man recalculates the value of something he'd carelessly misjudged. "Play something," he said, nodding toward the covered piano. "I don't play for free, Mr. Rocca. Everything's free between us right now. We're not on the clock." She played Chopin, her fingers finding the keys with the rusty familiarity of a skill she'd nearly let die. And Damiano, who had not cried at his own mother's funeral because he'd been too busy being furious, sat on the floor of that dusty room and felt something in his chest crack open for the first time in 15 years. Neither of them heard the door open. Camille stood in the frame for nearly a minute before either noticed her, watching Damiano watch Rosalind's hands with an expression he had never once worn for her in 11 months of engagement. "Am I interrupting?" Camille asked, her voice ice wrapped in silk. Damiano stood, unhurried. "Rosalind's helping me put together the set list, my mother's music." "How thoughtful." Camille crossed the room, her eyes flicking over the scattered sheet music, and something tightened in her expression when she saw a folder, half visible beneath a stack of papers, marked in faded ink, with a name that wasn't Elena Rocca's. Rosalind noticed it too, though she didn't understand its significance yet. V. Castellano, the same last name as the family that had run the largest rival operation on the East Coast before it collapsed entirely, 18 months after Elena's death. Camille reached down, casual, too casual, and slid the folder beneath a larger stack. "These boxes should really be cataloged. I'll have staff handle it." "I'll handle my mother's things myself," Damiano said, an edge entering his voice that made Camille's smile falter before she smoothed it back. "Of course," she said. "I only meant to help." She turned to Rosalind. "You have quite the range of talents. Singing, piano, infant rescue. Anything you can't do?" "I can't fake caring about things that don't matter to me," Rosalind said evenly. Seems like a useful skill in this family. Camille's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did, and she left without another word, though not before her gaze caught on the folder one more time. Damiano watched her go, his jaw tight. "I want you to remember exactly where that folder was," he said. "The name on it. Castellano. Any relation to the family that used to run things before yours did. They didn't collapse, Rosalind. They were destroyed. Every man in that family, dead or in prison, within 18 months of my mother's death." He looked toward the door Camille had disappeared through, something cold and calculating moving into his face. The expression of a man who has just found the first loose thread in a tapestry he'd assumed finished 15 years ago. "I need to know why my fiancé has a folder about them hidden in my mother's things." Rosalind felt the temperature of the room shift entirely, the intimacy of the last 3 hours giving way to something sharper, and she understood, with a clarity that settled cold in her stomach, that she had just stumbled into the edge of something far larger than a wedding gig, something that had already cost one woman her life 15 years ago, and might not be finished collecting its debts. The gala arrived 2 weeks later under a sky heavy with early June heat. The estate transformed into something out of an old photograph. String lights threaded through the gardens, a stage built along the terrace. Rosalind had spent the intervening weeks in a strange, charged orbit around Damiano, rehearsing songs, occasionally catching him watching her with an expression she didn't trust herself to name, and saying nothing more about the folder marked Castellano, though she noticed he'd started keeping a locked drawer in his study that hadn't been locked before. She also noticed that Camille had grown colder toward her by careful degrees, a chill that never showed itself in front of Damiano, only in the small windows when he'd stepped away. "You sing well for someone your size," Camille said one afternoon, adjusting an earring in a hallway mirror. "Most women like you don't have the confidence to get up on a stage at all." "I suppose that's admirable." "Most women like what, exactly?" Rosalind asked, not moving, though something old and tired stirred in her chest. "You know what I mean." Camille's smile was bright and empty. "I've learned that people who need to clarify their insults were compliments usually knew exactly what they were saying the first time." Camille left without another word, and Rosalind stood alone, reminding herself, the way she'd had to remind herself 1,000 times since she was 15, that her worth had never once been decided by women like Camille Voss. The gala itself unfolded beautifully for the first 2 hours. During the break before her final set, a guest, a hedge fund associate named Wesley Trent, who'd had 2 drinks too many, cornered Rosalind near the bar and asked her to dance with the particular confidence of a man used to hearing yes. "I'm working," Rosalind said, already stepping around him. "Come on, one song." His hand closed loosely around her wrist. "Let go of her," Damiano said, materializing beside them with a stillness that made Wesley's face drain of color. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She's not part of the entertainment package you can put your hands on. Find your car. Someone will drive you home." Wesley released her wrist and left without another word, and Damiano watched him go with a coldness Rosalind hadn't seen from him before, something proprietary and unmistakable, though he said nothing about it once the man was gone. "You didn't have to do that," Rosalind said. "I was handling it." "I know," Damiano said. "I wanted to anyway." He didn't look at her when he said it, and something about the admission, plain and unguarded, made Rosalind's pulse climb in a way she wasn't ready to examine. She found him alone on the terrace later, staring at the dark water, a drink he hadn't touched in his hand. "You look like a man attending his own funeral," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I spent this afternoon going through 15-year-old financial records," Damiano said. "My mother wired money to an account 3 months before she died. It traces back, eventually, to the Castellano family." "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet." He turned to her, something raw in his face she hadn't seen even in the memory room. "It means she might have been involved in something before she died that has nothing to do with the story I've told myself for 15 years. Maybe she was trying to protect someone, Rosalind said quietly. Maybe the money wasn't a betrayal. Maybe it was a rescue. You believe that? I believe people are rarely as simple as the worst thing anyone assumes about them. I'd know. For a moment, standing there in the dark, something passed between them that had nothing to do with music or money. And Damiano's hand turned beneath hers, palm to palm. Rosalind. Damiano. Camille's voice cut across the terrace like a blade, and they broke apart too quickly, in a way that told its own story. Your guests are asking for you. I'll be there in a moment. Now, Damiano. He went. Rosalind watched Camille's hand land on his arm with the proprietary grip of a woman marking territory, and felt something in her chest she recognized, with growing dread, as jealousy she had no right to. Packing up her sheet music afterward, she found Camille waiting, arms crossed. I don't know what you think is happening between you and Damiano, but remember what you are in this house. A singer, hired help with a nice voice, and an unfortunate amount of self-regard for someone built the way you are. Something cold and clear rose in Rosalind. Nothing like the old shame. I think you're more worried about what's happening between you and Damiano than anything happening between him and me. A woman secure in her engagement doesn't threaten the wedding singer twice in 1 month. Camille's eyes flickered, caught. That's right. I know about the text. I don't know how you got my number, and I don't care. But threatening me isn't going to make whatever you're hiding stay hidden. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know a folder marked Castellano went missing, the same day I saw it. I don't know why yet, but I will. You should be very careful, Camille said, dropping into something quiet and venomous, about what you think you know, and who you think is going to protect you when you know too much. She left, and Rosalind stood alone amid the scattered sheet music, hands trembling, understanding with sick certainty that she had just declared war on a woman with far more resources and far less conscience than she did. 3 days later, an anonymous tip arrived at a tabloid site, along with photographs, carefully cropped, of Rosalind's hand over Damiano's on the terrace, time-stamped and captioned to paint her as a gold-digging singer, seducing an engaged man. By morning, it had reached every wedding client on her books, and by afternoon, she'd lost 4 bookings and received a call from Damiano's assistant, informing her, with cold formality, that Mr. Rocca wished her to stay away from the estate until further notice. Rosalind read the text from Damiano's assistant 3 times. Mr. Rocca wishes you to stay away from the estate until further notice. Any further contact will be considered a breach of the retainer agreement. No explanation, no chance to respond, just a door closing in language, too formal to have come from the man who had held her hand on a dark terrace 3 nights earlier. The photographs were already everywhere. Her face and Damiano's hand captured in grainy nighttime light, captioned with insinuation, Rocca bride to be betrayed by curvy wedding singer. Sources say she's been angling for a ring all along. By morning it had reached every wedding client on her books. Marcus found her sitting on the kitchen floor that evening, phone dark in her lap, and sat down beside her without a word, the way he had when their father's business collapsed, and she'd held the family together at 19. 4 brides canceled today, Rosalind said. I built this business for 6 years, 1 wedding at a time, and it took 1 photo to burn half of it down. Rocca could fix this with 1 phone call. Rocca fired me. He didn't even call. He had his assistant do it. What Rosalind didn't know was that Damiano had spent the day locked in his study with his head of security, Tony Falcone, over a forensic report on the photograph's metadata. The timestamp had been altered. The crop had been surgical, designed to remove the fact that Camille had been standing in the doorway the entire time. Someone doctored this, Tony said, turning the laptop toward him. Whoever shot it was standing at an angle, only accessible from the East Terrace door. Same door Ms. Voss came through that night. You're telling me my fiancé staged a photo to destroy the reputation of a woman she's been threatening for a month. I'm telling you what the data shows. I'm not telling you what to do with it. But Damiano hadn't called Rosalind, and the reason was uglier than pure calculation. He'd spent that first day genuinely uncertain, wondering if he'd been careless, if he'd let something unprofessional bloom in full view of a woman he was supposed to marry. He'd ordered the distance between himself and Rosalind, not because he believed the worst of her, but because he couldn't yet separate his guilt over his own feelings from the mess the photograph had created. And in that hesitation, Camille had moved fast enough to make the damage permanent. Rosalind didn't beg. Something hard won in her, built across years of being underestimated, refused to let her chase an explanation from someone who hadn't bothered to ask for one first. Instead, she went to her remaining clients personally, told them plainly that nothing had happened beyond a professional event, and let them believe whatever they wanted. She lost 2 more bookings that week. She kept 6. It was Isabella who broke the silence 4 days later, showing up at Rosalind's apartment with a fury that had nothing to do with Rosalind at all. "I need to show you something," Isabella said, pushing past the doorway. "And you can't tell my brother I came here, because he's being an idiot." "What are you talking about?" Isabella pulled out her phone. "My daughter's nanny quit last week with no notice. I finally got her to talk yesterday." Her hand shook as she turned the phone toward Rosalind. Camille paid her to keep quiet about something she saw the day of the christening. She wasn't on a call with wedding vendors. She was on the phone with someone from the old Castellano network, telling them to be patient, that everything was almost in place. Why didn't the nanny say anything at the time? Camille paid her $10,000 to disappear. She only told me because she feels guilty watching what's happening to you in the press. Isabella's voice dropped. "I think whatever's in that folder isn't about the past. I think it's about what Camille's doing right now." Rosalind sat slowly on the arm of her couch, her mind racing back through every strange detail of the past 2 months. The hidden folder, the locked drawer, the account transfers tracing to a family everyone believed destroyed 15 years ago. Camille's cold fury, every time Rosalind got too close to something she shouldn't have seen. "Your brother thinks his mother might have been protecting someone with that money," Rosalind said slowly. "What if some piece of the Castellano family survived, quietly, and has been rebuilding for 15 years, with help from inside your own family?" Isabella's face went pale. Camille. Which means the photo, the leak, all of it, wasn't really about jealousy over your brother. It was about making sure nobody was standing close enough to him to notice what she's been doing. "You have to tell him. He fired me over a text message from his assistant," Rosalind said, and despite everything, some old hurt rose sharp in her chest. "I'm not walking back into that house to hand him a bombshell about his fiancée while he still believes whatever he wants to believe about me. Then let me tell him. But I need you to give me everything you know. Because if I'm right about what Camille's building toward, this isn't just about you anymore. And it isn't just about a 15-year-old car accident either." Rosalind looked at the frightened, furious young mother sitting on her couch, thought about Sophia's small body in her arms, the day she'd saved her, thought about Damiano's raw voice on the terrace, confessing his mother's death might not be the story he'd told himself for 15 years, and felt the last of her wounded pride give way to something steadier. "Tell me everything you know first," Rosalind said, "and then we're going to figure out exactly what Camille Voss is planning, and make sure she doesn't get away with it." Damiano learned the truth on the 6th day, not from Tony's forensic report, which had sat completed on his desk for 2 days while he avoided it, but from his sister, who walked into his study and threw her phone down hard enough to rattle the lamp. "Read that," Isabella said. "Then explain why you let a woman who saved your niece's life get dragged through the mud for 6 days, while you sat here doing nothing." Damiano read the message thread from the nanny twice. Something in his chest went cold in an entirely new way, the specific coldness of a man realizing he'd aimed his anger at the wrong target for a week, while the real threat operated freely in the space he'd left open. "Where is Camille?" he said, his voice dropping into a register Isabella had heard only twice in her life. "I don't know." "But Damiano, listen. This isn't just about Rosalind, and it isn't just about Mom. If the nanny's right, Camille's been in contact with someone from the Castellano network for months. That's not petty jealousy. That's a woman who's been positioning herself inside our family for 11 months, for a reason that has nothing to do with loving you." Damiano pulled up Tony's report. The metadata was unambiguous. The photo had been taken from the East Terrace door. The crop had been deliberate, surgical, designed to remove Camille's own presence from a moment she had orchestrated. He had let Rosalind twist in public humiliation for 6 days because he'd been afraid of his own feelings. "Call Tony," he said. "I want Camille's phone records for 6 months. Every transaction that doesn't trace back to a legitimate source. And I want to know where she is right now." It took Tony 4 hours to confirm what Isabella had already suspected. Camille Voss had been born Camille Castellano, her name changed by her mother at age 6, after her father, a lieutenant in the old Castellano operation, was killed in the collapse 15 years ago. She had spent 2 decades building a new identity, and 11 months earlier had engineered her introduction to Damiano with the precision of someone executing a plan years in the making. The Castellano family hadn't been fully destroyed after all. A handful of survivors, scattered and quiet, had spent 15 years rebuilding, waiting for the right opening. And Camille had been that opening. Elena Rocca. That was the piece that made Damiano's hands go cold. His mother's wire transfers hadn't been a betrayal. Tony's deeper dig, cross-referenced with old FBI filings, revealed Elena had discovered the Castellano infiltration attempt years before it fully materialized, and had been quietly funneling money to a witness protection contact to help a young woman escape the family entirely, a woman with information that could have exposed the whole operation. That woman had been Camille's own mother. Something had gone wrong. Camille's mother was killed instead, and somewhere in the wreckage of that failed rescue, a 19-year-old Camille had decided that Elena Rocca, and eventually her son, owed her family a debt, repaid only in blood and inheritance. "My mother was trying to save her," Damiano said, something in his voice breaking for the first time in 15 years. "She died, trying to save the woman who raised the person who's been engineering my destruction for 11 months. "Where's Rosalind in all this?" Isabella asked. If Camille thinks Rosalind is the reason her plan is unraveling, the thought didn't need finishing. Damiano called Rosalind's number for the first time in 6 days. Voicemail. He tried Marcus, who picked up on the second ring, voice tight with fear. "She's not answering. She left 2 hours ago to meet someone about a rush booking. Said it was good money, after losing so many clients this week. She hasn't come back." Who was the client? She didn't say. Just a referral. Someone who'd heard her sing at a gala. Marcus's voice cracked. "Mr. Rocca, is my sister in danger?" Damiano was already out the door, Tony beside him, barking orders about pulling every camera feed within 6 blocks of Rosalind's last known location. It took 11 minutes, the longest of Damiano's adult life, to trace her phone to a warehouse in Red Hook that Tony's team had flagged 18 months earlier, tied to old Castellano holdings, supposedly sold off in the collapse, and quietly repurchased through shell companies. Damiano's phone buzzed once, a text from a blocked number, and he read it in the back of the car, while Tony drove faster than the speed limit allowed. "You took my mother's family. I'm taking yours. She sang beautifully at that wedding, didn't she? Let's see how beautifully she sings when nobody's watching." Damiano's hand closed around the phone hard enough that Tony heard the case crack. "We're 8 minutes out," Tony said. "Talk to me. What do you need?" "I need her alive," Damiano said, his voice sounding exactly as young and frightened as he'd been the night his mother died. "Whatever it costs, whoever we have to go through, I need her alive." "Rosalind, bound to a metal folding chair beneath a bare bulb, having walked into what she'd believed was a legitimate booking, only to find Camille waiting instead of a bride, felt strangely calm, watching the other woman pace, phone in hand.
"He's not answering,"
Camille said, almost delighted.
"A week of silence. And now that you're missing, suddenly he cares."
"He's going to find you," Rosalind said, steadier than she felt. "And when he does, whatever debt you think the Rocca family owes yours, you're about to make it a great deal worse." Camille's smile was thin and without warmth. "Let him find me. I've been waiting 15 years for this conversation." Her eyes moved over Rosalind with clinical dismissal. "You, on the other hand, might not be so lucky." Rosalind had learned, building a business out of nothing for 6 years, that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she used that discipline now, cataloging the warehouse with careful eyes, while Camille paced. Exposed brick, a loading door chained from the inside, 3 men standing near the entrance with the stillness of people paid to be patient. "For someone who's spent 15 years planning revenge," Rosalind said, "you don't seem very good at getting people to do what you want. Careful. Why? You're going to hurt me either way. Might as well say what I want to say first." Rosalind shifted against the ropes at her wrists, testing them without making it obvious. "Your father died because the Rocca family destroyed the Castellano operation. But your mother didn't die because of the Roccas. She died because Elena Rocca was trying to get her out. You've spent 15 years being angry at the wrong family. Shut up. Elena wired money to help your mother disappear, not to hurt her, to save her." Rosalind watched Camille's face, for the crack she knew had to be there, because nobody built this much rage without a wound underneath it that had never properly healed. "Something went wrong. Your mother died anyway. But it isn't Elena's fault, and it isn't Damiano's fault. You don't know anything about my mother," Camille said, her voice cracking, just enough for Rosalind to hear the 19-year-old girl, still buried underneath 15 years of calculation. "She was murdered in front of me. I was 14. I watched men my father used to call friends put 2 bullets in her, because the rescue fell apart at the last minute, because someone talked, because the Roccas couldn't manage a simple extraction without getting my mother killed." "Do you know who talked?" Rosalind asked, quiet now. "Because I'd bet it wasn't Elena. I'd bet it was someone inside your own family who didn't want the extraction to succeed. Because a surviving witness with financial records would have brought down a lot more than just your father." Camille's face went white, then rigid, and for a moment, something cracked open behind her eyes. Some old suspicion never allowed to fully surface. Whatever she might have said next was lost in the sound of the loading door being torn from its chains. Damiano moved through the warehouse, the way Rosalind would later think of as something closer to a force of nature than a man. Tony and 4 others fanned out behind him, and the men Camille had stationed near the entrance put their hands up before a shot was fired. Damiano's eyes found Rosalind first, bound to the chair, and something in his face, the careful control he'd worn since he was 19, simply broke apart. He thought, in that half-second, of another moment he hadn't let himself examine closely until now. Rosalind in her performance gown a year earlier, holding his choking niece against her shoulder, without a second's hesitation, asking for nothing in return. She had been protecting his family long before he'd understood what she was worth. Damiano. Camille backed toward the far wall, phone still in her hand. "You came. How touching. I almost thought you'd let her rot here, just like you let her rot in the tabloids for a week." "I know about your mother," Damiano said, crossing the floor toward Rosalind, kneeling to work at the ropes with hands that were shaking slightly. "I know what mine tried to do. I know it went wrong. I'm sorry, Camille. But hurting Rosalind isn't going to undo any of it. Sorry." The word came out of her like something torn loose. 15 years, and the best you can offer is sorry. What do you want instead? You wanted my organization, my name, everything your father lost. Was any of it ever about your mother, or about what you thought you were owed? I was owed everything, Camille said, the mask she'd worn for 11 months finally shattering. Everything your family took from us. Everything I had to become to survive, after nobody came looking for a 14-year-old girl, left with men who saw her as a liability instead of a child. Her hand tightened around the phone. I was going to make you love me first, so you'd never see it coming, and then take everything the way your family took everything from mine. Tony's radio crackled, low, urgent, and his expression changed. Damiano. Nipty's 4 minutes out. Task force sweep. Unrelated to us. But it means this location's about to be crawling with uniforms who don't answer to you. Camille's eyes flicked toward the sound, and something in her posture shifted. The fear replaced, in an instant, by calculation. 4 minutes, she said softly, almost to herself. And Rosalind, still working her wrists free of the last of the rope, saw it a half-second too late. The small device in Camille's other hand, a phone already dialing, already sending. Someone warned her we were coming, Tony said, staring at his own radio. This op wasn't supposed to leak. Only 6 people knew this address before we left the estate. Camille smiled, thin and sharp, backing toward a service door half hidden behind stacked pallets that hadn't been there. Rosalind realized, on her way in. Ask your 6 people, Damiano. Ask which one of them still answers to my family instead of yours. She was through the door before Tony's men could close the distance, and by the time they forced it open, there was nothing behind it but an empty alley and the sound of a car already pulling away. Damiano stood in the wreckage of the warehouse, Rosalind free and shaking against his chest, and felt something colder than fear settle into his stomach. She's gone, he said, and someone in my own house told her we were coming. Tony's face was grim. 6 people knew this address. Me, you, Isabella, my second, Marco, your uncle Salvatore, and whoever Salvatore might have told. Find out which one, Damiano said, his arms still tight around Rosalind, his voice dropping into something Rosalind hadn't heard from him before, quiet and final. Because if there's a Castellano loyalist standing close enough to warn her, then this isn't finished. It isn't close to finished. And I don't know yet who else in my own family I can trust. Rosalind, still catching her breath against him, felt the ground shift beneath everything she'd believed was almost over. Camille wasn't caught. Camille was loose, armed with whatever she'd learned in that warehouse, and somewhere inside the Rocca organization itself, someone had just proven they would choose the Castellanos over the man they'd sworn to serve. It took 3 days to find the leak, and when Tony finally laid the evidence on Damiano's desk, his face had the particular stillness of a man about to betray someone he'd trained himself. Marco, he said, my own second. 10 years I vouched for him. Marco Diaz had joined Tony's security detail at 22, quiet, competent, easy to overlook in a room full of louder men. What nobody had known was that his mother's medical debt, 12 years old and buried under a false name, had been quietly purchased by a Castellano holding company 2 years earlier, and every month since, Marco had been fed a single, simple instruction: report where the family went, and when. He didn't know why, Tony said. Not until Camille needed the warehouse address. By then it was too late to walk away. Damiano didn't ask for excuses. He had Marco brought to the estate under guard, and Rosalind, present because Isabella had asked her to be, watched a young man's face collapse from practiced blankness into something raw and frightened as Damiano stood over him. She thought, watching him, of Camille in that same warehouse a week earlier, another person reduced to nothing but leverage and fear by a family that had decided, long before either of them were born, that debts got paid in blood, whether the person paying had chosen the debt or not. I never wanted any of this, Marco said, to no one in particular. I wanted my mother to keep her house. You should have come to me, Tony said, and there was more grief than anger in it now. 10 years, Marco. You should have come to me. Where is she? Damiano said. I don't know. I swear I don't know where she's hiding. She calls me. I don't call her. When did she call last? And Marco's hands were shaking. This morning. She wanted to know your schedule for tomorrow. The Founders' Day dinner at the estate. I told her I wouldn't do it anymore. That I was done. And she said it didn't matter what I did now. She said she already had everything she needed. The room went cold. Tony was already moving, radio in hand, calling for a full security sweep of the grounds before the dinner. But Damiano had gone very still, running back through every detail of the schedule Marco could have leaked. And Rosalind, standing near the window, said the thing nobody else had put together yet. She doesn't need the estate empty to hurt you, Rosalind said. She needs it full. Witnesses. The same way she needed witnesses when she went after my reputation. She's not planning to hurt you quietly. She's planning to destroy you in front of everyone who matters. The way she believes her mother was destroyed with nobody watching. Damiano turned to look at her, something sharpening in his face. Then we don't cancel the dinner. We use it. We control who's watching and when. Tony didn't like it. Isabella liked it less. But Rosalind, who had spent her whole adult life being underestimated in rooms full of people who assumed her softness meant she couldn't think clearly under fire, laid out a plan with the same steady competence she'd once used to clear an infant's airway. Seed the guest list with Tony's most trusted men, disguised as catering staff. Feed Marco a false detail to see where it surfaced, and let Camille believe she still had the advantage, right up until she didn't. It worked exactly as far as it was supposed to, and then it didn't. The false detail surfaced within hours, confirming Marco had one final channel to Camille that Tony's team hadn't cut off, a burner he produced only under direct threat of losing everything protecting his mother. Tony moved to intercept the line himself, alone, in the estate's old carriage house, and the last thing the earpiece caught, before it went silent, was Tony's voice saying, low and controlled, "Don't move," followed by a sound that made Damiano's blood go cold, and a silence that lasted 4 seconds too long. By the time Damiano and 2 of his men reached the carriage house, Tony was on the floor with blood spreading beneath him from a wound in his side, conscious but barely, and Marco was gone. And so, when Damiano turned to find her, was Rosalind, who had been standing at the carriage house door not 90 seconds earlier, and was nowhere in the estate now. She went after Marco herself, Isabella said, arriving breathless, pale. She said she saw him running toward the east gate, and went after him before any guard could catch up. Damiano. That was 10 minutes ago. Damiano stood in the carriage house doorway with Tony's blood on his hands, from trying to stop the bleeding. And for the first time since he was 19, standing in a hospital corridor being told his mother wasn't coming home, he felt the exact shape of losing everything close its hand around his throat. His phone buzzed. A photo. Rosalind, unconscious, slumped in the back seat of a car speeding away from the estate grounds, and beneath it, a line from a number he now knew by heart. "You should have let me have my sorry, Damiano. Now you get to know exactly what 15 years of losing everything feels like." Isabella was already calling for an ambulance for Tony, her voice shaking, and behind her the dinner guests, still unaware, were laughing over dessert in a ballroom 200 feet away, and Damiano stood in the space between those two worlds. The woman he loved missing, and a man who had served his family for 30 years, bleeding out on the floor in front of him, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that whatever Camille wanted from him now, she intended to take it from both directions at once, and that he had perhaps 30 minutes to decide which fight to win first. Rosalind woke in a moving car, with her hands zip-tied and her head throbbing, where something had struck her outside the carriage house, and the first clear thought that surfaced through the fog was not fear, but calculation, the same discipline that had once talked a wedding planner out of throwing her off a stage. Marco was driving. Camille sat beside her in the back seat, phone in hand, already composing the next message she intended to send.
You don't need me for whatever this is,
Rosalind said, her voice steadier than she felt.
Damiano already knows what Marco did.
Sending him a photo of me unconscious doesn't get you anything you don't already have. It gets me his undivided attention, Camille said, not looking up, which is more than I ever managed honestly. Marco's a liability now. He's been made. The moment this is over, he's the first person your own people cut loose, because a mole who got caught is worth less than nothing. Rosalind watched Camille's face in the rearview mirror, watched the flicker of calculation that told her the words had landed exactly where she'd aimed them. You've spent 15 years being someone's leverage. Don't spend the last hour of this plan turning another person into the same thing. Marco's hands tightened on the wheel. Camille noticed, and something cold crossed her face. Don't, she said. Don't what? Marco said, and for the first time, there was something other than fear in his voice. The car swerved, hard, onto the shoulder of the access road running along the old shipyard, and in the scramble that followed, Rosalind, wrists still bound but legs free, threw her weight sideways into Camille, as Marco wrenched the door open and ran, and the phone, the evidence, the whole architecture of Camille's plan, spilled loose across the seat between them. By the time Damiano's car found them 6 minutes later, guided by the last location ping from Camille's own phone, before Rosalind had knocked it beneath the seat, Camille was standing in the open door of the car with nothing left to leverage. No driver, no hostage fully in her control, and Rosalind sitting upright in the back seat, chin lifted, hands still bound but composure entirely intact. Damiano crossed the gravel toward her without looking at Camille first, and something in his face when he reached the car, when he saw Rosalind alive and furious rather than broken, cracked open in front of everyone watching. Tony's men, the 2 officers who'd arrived behind him, Isabella, who had refused to stay at the estate. I'm fine, Rosalind said, before he could ask. She didn't get what she wanted. I know, Damiano said, cutting her wrists free with a knife that shook slightly in his hand. I know exactly what she wanted, and I'm not going to let her have it. He turned to Camille then, and the ballroom stillness he was known for in every negotiation of his adult life settled over him like armor. It's over, he said. Not because I've won, because you were never actually fighting me. You were fighting a version of my family that stopped existing the moment my mother tried to save your mother, and failed. I can't give you back what you lost 15 years ago. Nobody can. But I can make sure you stop taking it out on people who had nothing to do with it. Camille didn't run. She stood very still, and something in her seemed almost relieved to finally be out of options. She really is smarter than you deserve, she said, nodding toward Rosalind. I hope you know that. I do, Damiano said. The officers took Camille into custody without incident, and Marco was found 2 hours later, 3 miles down the access road, and gave a full statement before the sun came up, naming every remaining Castellano associate who had helped Camille rebuild, enough to finish what Diane Whitfield's testimony would later confirm in a courtroom the following spring, that Elena Rocca had died trying to save the very family that would spend the next 15 years trying to destroy her son. By the time Isabella called the rest of the family that morning, the story was already moving through every branch of the Rocca network. Uncles, cousins, old allies, who had spent 15 years quietly doubting Elena's memory, all of them now hearing the truth at once, unfiltered, undeniable. Tony survived the surgery. He would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life, and would tell the story, whenever asked, as proof that loyalty built over 30 years outweighed a debt engineered over 2. It was near dawn, in the quiet after the ambulances and the police cars had gone, that Damiano found Rosalind sitting on the back steps of the estate, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the sky lighten over the water. You went after Marco yourself, he said, sitting beside her. You could have waited for help. I've spent my whole life waiting to be considered capable of handling things, Rosalind said. I wasn't going to start now. In the one moment, it actually mattered. Damiano was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had none of its usual careful control. I have spent 15 years believing that the only way to survive in this world was to trust no one and control everything. Tonight, I watched the woman I love talk her way out of a moving car because she trusted her own mind more than she trusted my rescue arriving in time. I don't want to control you, Rosalind. I want to build a life next to someone strong enough that I never have to. That's the first time you've said it, Rosalind said quietly. That word. Love. He said it again, steady, unhurried, like a man setting down something heavy he no longer intended to carry alone. I love you. I should have said it before tonight. I'm saying it now, in front of no one, because you deserve to hear it plainly, not as a performance for an audience. Rosalind turned to look at him, dawn light catching the exhaustion and the relief and the unmistakable certainty in his face, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since a wedding planner had tried to shrink her on a stage a year earlier. I love you too, she said. Now figure out what you're going to do about it. Camille's trial took place the following spring, and true to what Marco's statement and Diane Whitfield's testimony had already confirmed the night at the shipyard, the verdict was straightforward, where the sentencing was not. The judge, moved by the tragedy underlying the case, structured Camille's sentence with the possibility of parole after 8 years, more mercy than the Castellanos had shown the Roccas, or the reverse, 15 years earlier. Camille asked, through her lawyer, for a standing invitation to write to Sofia when she turned 18. Damiano approved it without hesitation, understanding now, better than most people ever would, that mercy and justice weren't always opposing forces. It was at the Rocca family's annual gala that June, 1 year after the night Damiano had first crossed a ballroom for a stranger, that he finished what he'd started at dawn on the shipyard steps. Rosalind was midway through her second song, the same terrace, the same string lights, when Damiano crossed the floor in front of 300 guests and climbed onto the small riser, taking the microphone gently from her hand. A year ago, he said, his voice carrying across a garden gone completely silent, a woman stood on a stage very much like this one, and refused to let anyone convince her she didn't belong there. Something in me, that had been closed for 15 years, decided, in that moment, that it wasn't going to stay closed anymore. He turned to her, his hand steady when it found hers. You have never once needed anyone to defend your worth. I would like the rest of my life to spend proving I understand exactly how much that worth is, every single day, if you'll let me. He knelt and opened a small box that caught the last of the evening light, and Rosalind Hale, who had spent her whole life being told she took up too much space, stood in front of 300 people and let herself be exactly, entirely, unapologetically seen. Yes, she said, before he'd finished the question, and the garden erupted into applause that sounded, to her trained ear, like the kind that comes only once or twice in a person's life, the kind that means something broken has finally been set right. The wedding took place that October, in the same gardens, with one condition that made Damiano laugh in front of the wedding planner they'd finally hired, a woman named Priya, with none of her predecessor's cruelty. I want to sing at my own wedding, Rosalind said. Just one song. For him. Priya, sensing correctly that this bride would not be talked out of anything, simply nodded. Marcus walked her down the aisle, having finished his nursing degree that spring, with a scholarship fund still technically anonymous, though the whole family knew whose money had made it possible. You did this, he whispered, handing her off at the end of the aisle. All of it. Remember that. Isabella stood as matron of honor, Sophia toddling ahead with a basket of rose petals she mostly threw at guests, healthy and laughing. Tony walked with a slight limp to his seat, waving off anyone who offered an arm, and Diane Whitfield sent a card instead of attending. Elena would have loved this. Damiano kept it in his jacket pocket through the ceremony. The vows were plain, unadorned by promises that sound beautiful and mean nothing years later. Damiano promised he would never again let silence stand in for courage, that he understood now the difference between protecting someone and standing beside them. Rosalind promised she would never again shrink herself for anyone's comfort, that she intended to take up exactly as much space as she needed for the rest of her life, and that she expected him to watch her do it without flinching. He didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched in over a year. During the reception, Rosalind climbed onto the stage once more and asked for just a piano, which one of Damiano's cousins played well enough to accompany her. She chose a piece from the box of Elena's old sheet music, found together on the floor of that dusty East Wing room, a simple melody Elena had written and never published. Rosalind had written words to it that spring, quietly, telling only Isabella, who cried the first time she heard them. She sang it now to a garden full of people who had watched this story unfold in pieces, some of whom had once judged her, tried to shrink her, and who now sat in moved silence as her voice filled the same terrace where she had once stood accused of being an embarrassment, in a dress too small for someone's narrow idea of beauty. The old wedding planner sat near the back, invited as a professional courtesy, watching with an expression that had softened over the past year, from contempt into something like humbled respect. When the song ended, Damiano crossed the stage and took her hand, not to lead her away, but simply to stand beside her, while the applause rose around them. "You were right," he murmured. "Nobody should carry their wounds alone. Not Camille, not my mother, not you, not me." "Not anymore," Rosalind agreed. They danced their first dance to At Last, the very song that had started this entire story, on a night a wedding planner tried to remove her from a stage for daring to take up space in a dress that didn't apologize for her body. Damiano held her the way he'd learned to hold everything that mattered to him, not with the tight grip of a man afraid of losing what he owned, but with the open, steady presence of a man who had finally learned that love wasn't something you protected by shrinking the world around it. It was something you protected by standing in it, fully, without flinching, no matter who was watching. Later, after the last guests had gone, Rosalind stood on the terrace in her wedding dress, looking out at the dark water Damiano had once stared at, with an untouched drink, grieving a mother whose story he hadn't yet understood. He came to stand beside her now, the way he had that first night, though everything between them had changed. "Regrets?" he asked. "Only one," Rosalind said, leaning into him. "That it took so much for you to finally cross that ballroom the right way." "I crossed it exactly the right way the first time," Damiano said. "I just needed a year to earn the right to stay once I got there." Rosalind smiled, unashamed of the space she took up in the world, unafraid of being seen exactly as she was, a woman who had once been told she was too much for any stage, standing now at the center of a life built entirely around the truth that she had never, not for a single moment, been too much for anything at all. "Then stay," she said. He did.